All right, guys, we're going to talk a little bit about population ecology. So far, we've talked about a lot of ecological stuff, and we've talked about biomes. And what we're going to talk about for the next two sections here are about populations of animals and of humans as well. And so a population is a group of interbreeding individuals of the same species. So if we look at all these birds here, they're pretty much all the same species. They can interbreed with each other, and so collectively we call those a population. Remember that we could also have a community where we've got a bunch of different species, okay? And then if we add in the abiotic factors, then it becomes an ecosystem, okay? And if it's a large, stable ecosystem, that becomes a biome. And so population is sort of that level a little bit below the communities and the biomes and the ecosystems that we've been studying. So most species are going to live together in what we call a certain dispersion pattern, okay? So there are a bunch of species that live in what we call a clump-like pattern, okay? Think of like a small herd, not thousands upon thousands of them, but that's clumping. And there are lots of advantages to clumping. So like the fact that something like elephants clump together means that even though elephants are herbivores, that they're able to fend off the carnivores better, and that when one of them finds water, the whole group of them finds water or food or whatever. Now, of course, there's some disadvantages too if they're all together and something happens, if there's a flood or something like that, that's able to wipe out a lot of them. Or a disease, obviously, if they're in a clump, then that spreads really quickly through the disease. But in general, clumping is a pretty good type of dispersion pattern. We can also have a uniform dispersion pattern, and it's a little hard to see the way I set this up in this picture, sorry about that. But so if you've got a bunch of plants and they're very evenly placed, with each other. So like if let's just say that we were drawing dots for them, they would be all sort of in an equal distance from each other. So they're, I've got 2 and then 4, and so they're all equally spaced out from each other to a large degree. Now it doesn't mean that they're exactly equally displaced. Like in the case of plants, I mean, if we went out and measured them, they wouldn't be exact, but they would be relatively uniform. And the reason for that is because they've got these root structures and they have to each get a certain amount of water. And so the ones that are living are going to be uniformly dispersed out. What we can also have as our third dispersion pattern is what's called a random dispersion. And so if you look at this group here and you look at the dandelions here, you've got sort of a clump here, and then they're more spread out, and so maybe in one part of the field there's 1 or 2, and then in another part there's a whole bunch clumped together. A very random distribution, just sort of depending on where their seeds go, and you can sort of see the reason behind that is because dandelions are going to disperse their seeds as they get blown, and they're obviously going to get blown in random directions, and they're going to grow where they land for the most part, and so that's going to be a random dispersion pattern. Okay, so we've got clumping, we've got uniform, and we've got random dispersion pattern. Remember, dispersion pattern just means how is that species arranged? How is that population arranged? Are they arranged in groups, okay, which would be clumping? Are they sort of distributed evenly, which would be uniform? Or are they just sort of haphazardly wherever? And obviously that would be a random dispersion. What also matters for us in population is what's the density of the population? We know if you remember back from your physics class or your chemistry class even, that typically speaking, density is mass divided by volume, okay? So in our case, it's not going to be mass divided by volume. Instead, what it's going to be is our population density is going to be species, okay? So number of species per area, okay? And it could be volume too if we're talking about like in the ocean or in the sky for birds or something. But typically speaking, we talk about area because we're talking about a land area. And so species per area is your population density. And you can have a really tight density where you've got a whole lot of organisms in that one area, or it can be really small, and it really depends a lot on what type of organism. So if you've got one of those apex predators like a tiger, their population density is going to be pretty small. You're not going to find a whole lot of tigers in a given area. But if you're talking about something like, say, rabbits or rodents or maybe insects or something, you might find a massive amount of them in a particular area. So if you look at, say, like an anthill, there's a lot of different individual ants packed in a really small area. So that makes it a really high density. And to go along with this, to determine what happens to a population, we have what we call density independent factors. So when we say independent, it means that it doesn't depend on the density. Those are usually abiotic factors, things like weather events. There are some abiotic factors that are dependent on the density, something like, say, a water amount of water. If there's a high density, then obviously those organisms are going to be using a lot of that water. But we have density independent things like weather effects or fire or something like that that may not be dependent on the density. Now they may be, if we're talking about plants, something like a fire would be dependent on the density. Are the trees really tightly packed together such that it's going to help the fire to grow bigger? That's density dependent factors. Now usually that's going to depend on how many members or of that population. That should be an of, not an or. Sorry guys, right there, of, there we go, of a population in a given area. And that is going to affect a whole bunch of different things, actually. Depending on how tightly things are packed together, it can affect the rate at which disease spreads, the amount of parasites that can get on the different individuals in the species. It affects the competition. If there's a really high density, if you've got a lot of different if you get a lot of that same species and they're all going after the same resources, that's a lot of competition. It makes predation a little bit easier. If there's a high density, then it's easier for the predators to find them. That sort of goes, if we said clumping's good for the elephants because they can fight off predators, but it's also good for the predators because they can find a lot of food in one place instead of, say, they're spread out a lot. So those are density dependent factors. And remember, when we're talking about populations, density means how many individuals of that species are in that certain area. So if we're talking about overall population, there's a formula for that. And I know that, don't let that scare you off because you're not going to have to work a whole lot of math for it. But what you need to know is the population change depends on these things. It depends on the births plus immigration. Now, immigration is one of these things we think about like, well, I mean, people are going from country to country. What that means if we're talking about like plants or animals, it means outside species coming into an ecosystem, okay? Or species that weren't originally in that ecosystem coming into that ecosystem. And it could be immigration or it could be in terms of migration as well, right? Birds move from one ecosystem to another. That's going to add to the population of, say, the southern ecosystem in the winter when they fly down there. And it's going to add to the population of the northern ecosystem when they fly back to their normal ecosystem. So births plus immigration. Immigration is coming into an area. And then from that, we subtract the deaths plus the emigration. And really, again, I don't know what is going on here with my slides here, but that should be a plus. Okay, so we're going to subtract the deaths plus the emigration. Now, emigration means things are moving out. So maybe in a particular ecosystem, something happened, a lot of predators moved in, and so a lot of the herbivores left that area and went to a different ecosystem. That would be emigration. They're moving from one area to another. Or maybe they're a migratory herd. Maybe it's something like bison or something like that, and they're moving from one area to another. That means that in a given area, the population is going to decrease as they leave that area. Now, the stuff that we obviously think about that makes really good sense is sort of the top part of this equation, births and deaths. And that'll get you a long way as long as you remember the births and deaths. But remember that there's also the part where things can move into or out of the ecosystem as well. So I want to look real briefly here at a couple of terms, a couple of concepts here related to a graph. Now what you see here is anytime you look at a graph, we've been over lots this year, anytime you see a graph, you should always look at what the axes are. So on the y-axis here, we've got population. We've got time on the x-axis. So that means as time goes this way, okay, then what happens to population? Well, in general, if a population is growing well, in general what we have is what's called a J-curve. Okay, the J-curve is this part of the graph right here, and I'm going to just sort of trace along it. It's the part of the graph here where you start out with a low population, and then over the course of time, that population is going to increase. It's called a J-curve. Whoops. It's called a J-curve because in general that looks sort of like a J. Okay, that it's starting low and then it exponentially goes up. Okay, so that's the J-curve part of the graph. What we can also have, though, is an S-curve. And the S-curve, you'll notice, includes part of the J-curve here. But the S-curve includes the part that once you get to a certain point, called the carrying capacity, and we'll talk about that in a second, the population is going to start to decrease again, or it's going to start to level out. Okay, and it's called an S-curve, again, because if you trace that sort of curve there, it sort of looks like an S. Okay, S up here, all the way down there. Okay, and so that's what we call an S-curve. And the S-curve includes this part where we get above the carrying capacity, and then the population starts to decrease or go back down again. So the question then becomes, what then is the carrying capacity? So the carrying capacity is basically what's the maximum number of individuals long term, not in the short term, because in the short term you could have a lot, just like in a in a restaurant, you might be able to say, okay, well, at lunchtime they can support, they've got enough food for 300 people. But if those 300 people were there every day eating food, that restaurant's going to run out of food pretty quickly. And so environments work in much the same way. And so that's the carrying capacity. Once the population reaches this green line here, it can go above it temporarily, but then it's going to start to eventually fall back down to it. And eventually it's going to level off to a nice even point here at the carrying capacity, because that's the maximum amount that it can hold. Okay, so that's the maximum amount, is the carrying capacity. Now, what that does is it leads us to two distinct types of organisms. We've got what we call an r-strategist organism and a k-strategist organism. The r-strategist organism, basically these are things like insects or rodents or plants that reproduce a lot. They're going to make a lot of offspring. They tend to have really short lifespans, and the way that they manage the carrying capacity is that they're sort of always staying right at it. They're always at that part up here in the S-curve where it's oscillating back and forth. They're going to reproduce really quickly. Some of them are going to die off, and then they're going to go back up. And so you might see a little bit more wide variation. So whereas we've got this carrying capacity here where it sort of seems like it's staying above, so they might go up a lot and then come back down and then back up and then come back down. That's an r-strategist. Okay, lots of offspring, really short lifespans typically. Again, think of insects are a great example. Even something like rodents, where their lifespan might be a couple of years, but they might have hundreds of offspring in that time. That's sort of the opposite of what we call a k-strategist, and a k-strategist means that they don't have a lot of offspring, but that those organisms spend a lot of time and energy trying to raise those offspring and protect those offspring so that they'll make it to adulthood. Humans really are a really great example of this, that typically humans don't have a lot of offspring. And if you think, well, no, some families like the Dugars have, 20 kids or whatever, they do, but that's over a long course of time too, right? And they're putting a lot of resources into each individual child. It also means that each of these children of the k-strategist tend to be relatively vulnerable, younger in their lives, for a long period of time, and it might take a while to raise them. And again, humans are a great example. Human children obviously would be vulnerable for lots and lots of years, and so it takes a lot of effort to be able to raise them. The reason that you might have something like that and what you'll see is these tend to be much larger organisms, so it's not very resource efficient to produce a whole lot, but that they can put more resources in. The fewer offspring you have, the more resources that you can put into each organism. Now, one thing that I didn't actually make a separate slide for, and I want to jump back here and let me erase some of this stuff that I had on this last slide, is sort of what are the consequences then of if you go above your carrying capacity? Okay, so let me go back and sort of give us a blank slate here as far as our graph here. So we said that normally you get a nice little J-curve, and so you start out low population over the course of time. It exponentially goes up. So let's say that your food sources, like all of a sudden that you're a herd of bison and you came upon a really rich grassland, and so you kept producing, and so eventually you reach a point where you're starting to consume all of the food sources. And once you consume all of the food sources, what eventually is going to happen is that you're going to have a crash back down. This is what we call a dieback. When you get to that point where the population increases really rapidly and then all of a sudden the food sources run out, or there's so many of them that diseases, remember population density, diseases can spread more easily, disease starts to wipe out a vast amount of them, and then you get a dieback, a really rapid decline in the population where it goes back down. And then obviously over the course of time, that population might be able to recover. You get sort of another little J-curve type area here, and then eventually you're going to get back up to another S-curve because you're going to get up to that carrying capacity and then sort of level out. Now the hope is that what you really would like if you're an organism is that you want to get to that carrying capacity and be at the carrying capacity without sort of the wide oscillations that we had when we looked at that S-curve originally. What you want is sort of to get up to that point of the carrying capacity and sort of level out and just sort of maybe stay at that carrying capacity. Remember, the definition of carrying capacity is that it can be supported long term. And so if you're at a level there, you're just going to stay at the carrying capacity for a long time. K strategists on the whole tend to be a little bit better at this than R strategists, because R strategists are going to have a lot more population density because they produced a lot of offspring. Okay? So hopefully that gives you some ideas on some of our definitions. What we're going to do in the next videos is apply these same sorts of terminology directly to human population and sort of do a little bit of population ecology analysis for humans. All right, thanks guys.